All her life, ELENA MARTINEZ had been invisible. The girl everyone overlooked, the woman they said no man would ever want. At 28, she had learned to accept the cruel whispers that followed her through the streets of Brooklyn. Her plain appearance and quiet demeanor made her forgettable in a world that valued beauty and boldness. But invisibility can be a shield. And tonight, it would save her life. When gunshots erupted outside Rosetti's diner, ELENA instinctively dropped behind the counter. Through the chaos, she watched the most feared man in New York, DOMINIC TORRINO, the Mafia boss, whose name made grown men cross themselves, storm through the door. Blood on his shirt, fury in his dark eyes. Their eyes met across the destruction. Time stopped. The most dangerous man in the city fell to his knees before the woman everyone said would never be wanted. But what could make a king bow to someone the world had forgotten? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. ELENA MARTINEZ had grown up in a one-bedroom apartment above Murphy's hardware store, where the floorboards creaked with every step and winter cold seeped through windows that never quite closed properly. Her mother, Carmen, had been 16 when ELENA was born, and the weight of single motherhood had aged her beyond her years. Micha, you have to be realistic about your expectations, Carmen would say, brushing ELENA's unruly brown hair with rough strokes. Not every girl gets to be a princess. Some of us are meant for different things. By age 8, ELENA understood what different things meant. While other girls in her class received Valentine's and birthday party invitations, ELENA learned to find contentment in books borrowed from the library and quiet afternoons spent alone. The scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, courtesy of a childhood accident involving broken glass, ensured that she would always be marked as different. High school brought new levels of cruelty. Dog face, they called her. Scarface, the girl nobody wants. ELENA perfected the art of invisibility, moving through hallways like a ghost, eating lunch in empty classrooms, finding refuge in academic achievement that no one seemed to notice or care about. At 18, when her mother died from complications related to diabetes, ELENA discovered the harsh reality of being truly alone. The funeral drew 6 people, including herself and the priest. Among her mother's few possessions, ELENA found a simple gold wedding band wrapped in tissue paper, the ring Carmen had pawned during ELENA's childhood, but somehow managed to retrieve before her death. It was the only tangible proof that someone had once loved her mother enough to promise forever. ELENA pawned the ring the following week to pay for groceries. The next decade passed in a blur of survival. ELENA worked various jobs: cashier at a grocery store, night cleaner at an office building, waitress at establishments that hired based on desperation rather than appearance. Each position reinforced the same lesson. She was replaceable, forgettable, useful only for her willingness to work long hours without complaint. Rosetti's diner became her sanctuary 3 years ago. Tony Rosetti, the 70-year-old owner, had hired her not despite her scar, but because he understood what it meant to be overlooked. His own limp, courtesy of a construction accident decades earlier, had taught him that sometimes the most reliable employees were those whom the world had already written off. ELENA's apartment on Prospect Street reflected her circumstances. A studio with barely enough space for a twin bed, a small table, and a hot plate. The walls were bare, except for a single photograph of her mother, taken during happier times ELENA couldn't quite remember. Her possessions fit into 2 suitcases, a reminder that everything in her life was temporary. Every morning, ELENA followed the same routine. She walked the 12 blocks to Rosetti's, arriving before dawn to prep vegetables and start coffee. The early morning hours were her favorite, quiet, peaceful, filled with the promise that each day might be different, even though it never was. The diner's regular customers barely acknowledged her existence. She was simply the waitress who refilled coffee cups and cleared tables, as much a fixture as the red vinyl booths and checkered linoleum floor. Businessmen discussed deals while she wiped down their tables. Construction workers flirted with the prettier waitresses while she remained invisible. Elderly couples reminisced about their courtships while she served their usual orders, a ghost moving through other people's stories. Elena had made peace with her invisibility. It was safer than hoping for something different, easier than risking rejection or disappointment. She had learned to find satisfaction in small things, perfectly brewed coffee, a clean counter. The satisfaction of a hard day's work completed without incident, but invisibility, she discovered on that Tuesday night in September, could also be a form of protection. She was wiping down tables after the dinner rush when the first gunshots shattered the evening calm. Through the diner's large front window, she saw muzzle flashes in the parking lot, heard shouting in languages she didn't recognize. Her instincts, honed by years of avoiding trouble, sent her diving behind the counter just as the front door exploded inward. Glass scattered across the floor like deadly confetti. Through the chaos, Eleanor watched a man stride through the wreckage with the confident gait of someone accustomed to violence. Blood stained his white shirt, but he moved without apparent injury, suggesting the blood belonged to someone else. Even from her hiding place, Elena recognized him. Everyone in Brooklyn knew Dominic Torrino's face, even if they'd never seen him in person. Newspapers ran his photograph whenever another competitor disappeared or another police investigation mysteriously stalled. He was power incarnate, danger wrapped in expensive suits, the kind of man who could end lives with a gesture. Their eyes met across the destroyed diner. And Elena's world shifted on its axis. Dominic Torrino had never intended to become the most feared man in New York. At 35, he carried the weight of a legacy that stretched back 4 generations, each one adding layers of blood and betrayal to the family name. The signet ring on his right hand, bearing the Torrino family crest, had been worn by his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather before him, each man leaving behind a reputation that the next was expected to exceed. The Torrino crime family controlled everything from the Brooklyn docks to the high-end restaurants in Manhattan, their influence spreading like ink through water across legitimate businesses and underground operations alike. Dominic hadn't chosen this life, but he'd proven exceptionally good at it. Where his father had ruled through explosive violence and his grandfather through calculated intimidation, Dominic had developed a more subtle approach, though no less deadly. His soldiers respected him because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. His enemies feared him because his retribution was swift, thorough, and creative. The police tolerated him because he kept his operations clean and his violence contained within his own world. The press found him fascinating because he possessed the kind of dark charisma that sold newspapers and attracted viewers. But tonight, the careful balance of his world had been shattered by a business deal gone catastrophically wrong. Vincent Castellano, head of the rival family that had been encroaching on Torrino territory for months, had proposed a meeting to discuss boundaries and mutual profit. The location, a neutral warehouse near the waterfront, should have been safe ground. Instead, it had been an ambush. Dominic's driver and bodyguard, Tommy Ricci, lay dead in the warehouse parking lot. 2 of Castellano's men had died in the subsequent firefight, but Dominic had barely escaped with his life. His white shirt, torn and blood-stained, bore witness to how close he'd come to joining Tommy in death, racing through Brooklyn streets with bullets lodging in his car's rear window. Dominic had spotted the warm lights of Rosetti's diner and made a split-second decision to take refuge. He needed a moment to regroup, to call for backup, to plan his next move against an enemy who had just declared open war. He hadn't expected to find salvation in the eyes of a scarred waitress. The moment their gazes met across the destroyed diner, something fundamental shifted in Dominic's understanding of the world. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Money, protection, power, status. Women threw themselves at him because of his reputation and wealth. Men sought his approval because it could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. But this woman, crouched behind the counter with glass in her hair and terror in her eyes, looked at him without calculation or desire. She saw him not as Dominic Torrino, heir to a criminal empire, but simply as a man who had brought violence into her quiet sanctuary, and inexplicably, impossibly, that recognition drove him to his knees. Later, Dominic would struggle to explain what happened in that moment. To his lieutenant Marco Vitali, who arrived 20 minutes later with a cleanup crew and reinforcements, Dominic would claim temporary disorientation from blood loss. To the police who questioned him about the shooting, he would maintain that he had simply been seeking medical attention and the diner's destruction was coincidental. But privately, in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to acknowledge truth, Dominic knew that falling to his knees before ELENA Martinez had been the most honest gesture of his adult life. Marco found his boss sitting in a booth near the back of the diner, his shirt changed, his face cleaned of blood, speaking in low tones to a woman Marco barely glanced at. The cleanup crew worked efficiently around them, removing evidence and preparing explanations for the inevitable police investigation. "Boss, we need to move," Marco said, his concern evident despite his professional calm. "Castellano's people might circle back, and the cops are already asking questions about the warehouse." Dominic nodded but didn't immediately stand. Instead, he reached into his wallet and withdrew a business card. Black stock with gold lettering that simply read D. Torrino and a phone number. "If you need anything," he told ELENA, his voice carrying an intensity that made Marco's eyebrows rise. "Anything at all?" ELENA stared at the card as if it might burst into flames. "I don't understand what just happened here." "Neither do I," Dominic admitted, and the honesty in his voice surprised even himself. As they left the diner, Marco couldn't contain his curiosity. "Boss, what was that about?" "The waitress, I mean." Dominic was quiet for several blocks, watching familiar Brooklyn streets pass by the bulletproof windows of his replacement vehicle. Finally, he spoke. "Have you ever met someone and felt like you were seeing yourself clearly for the first time?" Marco, who had known Dominic since childhood and prided himself on understanding his boss's motivations, found himself genuinely puzzled. "No, sir. Can't say that I have." Dominic touched the signet ring on his finger, feeling the weight of generations of Torrino men who had ruled through fear and died through violence. "Neither had I." 3 days passed in a haze of restless sleep and anxious glances toward the diner's front door. ELENA had cleaned up the glass, helped Tony file insurance claims, and tried to pretend that her life hadn't been fundamentally altered by 90 seconds of chaos. But Dominic Torrino's business card lay hidden beneath her mattress like a ticking bomb, and she found herself touching it compulsively during sleepless nights. The morning news had provided fragments of the story: a shooting at a waterfront warehouse, 2 men dead, police investigating possible organized crime connections. Dominic's name wasn't mentioned, but ELENA recognized the carefully neutral language that meant everyone knew more than they were saying. She was refilling salt shakers during the afternoon lull when the bell above the diner's door chimed. ELENA looked up from her work and felt her heart stop. Dominic Torrino stood in the entrance, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than ELENA made in 6 months. He looked nothing like the blood-soaked figure from 3 nights ago. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his face clean-shaven, his movements controlled and confident. But his eyes, those intense brown eyes that had looked at her with such inexplicable recognition, were exactly the same. The diner's few customers took one look at him and found excuses to leave. Quickly, Mrs. Henderson, who had been nursing a cup of coffee and complaining about her arthritis for the past hour, suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. The construction workers, who usually lingered over pie and crude jokes, gathered their things with unprecedented efficiency. Within minutes, ELENA and Dominic were alone, except for Tony, who retreated to the kitchen with uncharacteristic discretion. Dominic approached the counter where Eleanor stood frozen, her hand still gripping a half-filled salt shaker. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, but there was something almost hesitant in his approach, as if he wasn't entirely certain of his welcome. "Coffee?" Elena managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please?" She poured with shaking hands, hyper-aware of his gaze following her every movement. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and impossible circumstances. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," Dominic said finally. Elena set the coffee cup before him, noting that his hands were steady where hers trembled. "I'm fine. No one was hurt here." "Good." He lifted the cup but didn't drink, using the motion to study her face. "I also wanted to apologize for bringing trouble to your workplace, for frightening you." Elena's grandmother's rosary, hidden beneath her uniform shirt, seemed to grow warm against her skin. Rosa Martinez had been a woman of deep faith who believed that God sometimes spoke through the most unlikely messengers. Standing before this dangerous, beautiful man, Elena wondered if her grandmother's wisdom applied to situations involving organized crime. "You didn't frighten me," Elena lied, then immediately corrected herself. "Not the way you think. I was frightened of the guns, the violence, but not of you." Dominic's eyebrows rose slightly. "Most people are afraid of me. Most people haven't watched you fall to your knees for no reason they can understand." The words escaped before Elena could stop them, bringing a flush of heat to her cheeks. She busied herself with unnecessary cleaning motions, avoiding his gaze. "There was a reason," Dominic said quietly. Elena's hand stilled on the counter. "What reason?" "I don't know yet." The honesty in his voice made Eleanor look up. He was studying her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but instead felt like recognition, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering him for years. "This is crazy," Elena whispered. "Yes, you're Dominic Torrino. You're—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything she couldn't say aloud. "I know what I am, and I'm nobody. I'm the girl men don't notice, don't want, don't remember." Dominic set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "You're wrong about that. Am I? Look at me. Really look." Eleanor touched the scar along her jaw, the physical reminder of everything that set her apart. "This is what I am. This is what I'll always be." Dominic stood and walked around the counter before Elena could react. He moved slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose. But Elena found herself rooted in place by the intensity of his approach. He stopped just close, enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle, that spoke of a world far removed from the diners. Familiar aromas of coffee and grease. "I've been looking at you," he said softly. "I haven't been able to stop looking at you for 3 days. Elena's breath caught. "Why?" "Because when I look at you, I see something I didn't know I was searching for." His hand rose toward her face, hovering just inches from her scarred cheek. Elena held her breath, caught between the desire to lean into his touch and the terror of believing this moment could be real. "What do you see?" she whispered. "Home," Dominic replied. And the single word carried the weight of a confession. The Torrino family Bible sat open on Dominic's mahogany desk, its leather binding worn smooth by generations of hands, recording births, deaths, and marriages. The pages chronicled a bloodline that stretched back to Sicily, each entry written in careful script that documented the family's rise from poor immigrants to American power brokers. Dominic traced his finger along the marriage records, noting how each Torrino man had chosen his bride. Strategic alliances with other families, unions designed to consolidate territory or settle debts. Love, if it existed at all in these arrangements, had been a fortunate accident rather than a driving force. His own name appeared at the bottom of the page, followed by a blank line that had remained empty for 35 years. His mother had mentioned it frequently before her death, reminding him that the family line required continuation, that his responsibilities extended beyond mere business operations. Now, staring at that empty space, Dominic found himself imagining ELENA Martinez's name inscribed in his careful handwriting. The thought was absurd. ELENA possessed no connections to useful families, no dowry of territory or influence, no strategic value whatsoever. She was a waitress from Brooklyn whose greatest asset was her ability to remain unnoticed. By every rational measure, she represented the worst possible choice for a man in Dominic's position, and yet he couldn't stop thinking about her. The intercom on his desk buzzed. "Boss, you have a visitor," came Marco's voice. "Send them up." To Dominic's surprise, the visitor was Father Angelo Benedetto, the elderly priest who had served the Italian community in Brooklyn for over 40 years. Father Angelo had baptized Dominic, heard his first confession, and officiated at his mother's funeral. He was one of the few people who could enter Dominic's office without fear or calculation. "Dominic, my son," Father Angelo said, settling into the chair across from the desk with a grunt of effort. "You look troubled." "Just business concerns, Father." "Ah," the priest's eyes twinkled with knowing humor. "The kind of business that requires reading the family Bible at 3 in the afternoon." Dominic closed the book and pushed it aside. Father Angelo had always possessed an uncomfortable ability to see through surface explanations to deeper truths. "I've been thinking about marriage," Dominic admitted. "Finally, your mother, God rest her soul, worried that you would die alone and childless." "There's a woman," Dominic said carefully. "Someone unexpected." Father Angelo leaned forward with interest. "Tell me about her." "She's not what you would call a traditional choice. The best choices rarely are." "What is she like?" Dominic struggled to find words that could encompass ELENA's quiet strength, her graceful acceptance of hardship, the way she had looked at him without fear or agenda. "She's pure," he said finally. "In a world full of people who want something from me, she wants nothing. And this troubles you." "It terrifies me," Dominic confessed. "I could offer her everything. Money, protection, a life she's never dreamed of, and she would probably refuse." Father Angelo chuckled. "Most women would be grateful for such an offer. That's exactly why I've never made it to anyone else." The priest studied Dominic with the penetrating gaze of someone who had spent decades reading human souls. "You're afraid she'll reject you not for what you lack, but for what you are, wouldn't you? If someone like me walked into your life." "Someone like you walked into my life 40 years ago," Father Angelo replied gently. "An angry young man who had inherited violence and responsibility in equal measure. I didn't reject that young man. I tried to help him find his way to something better." Dominic rose and walked to the window overlooking the Brooklyn streets. Below, ordinary people lived ordinary lives, unaware that their safety and prosperity depended partly on the decisions made in rooms like this one. "She deserves better than what I can offer her." "What can you offer her?" "Protection, wealth, status." Dominic paused. "Love, I think. Though I'm not sure I know what that means anymore. Love means being willing to become worthy of someone's trust," Father Angelo said. "It means choosing to be better than you were before you met them. And if I'm not capable of becoming better, then you're not capable of loving her the way she deserves." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge wrapped in gentle rebuke. Dominic had built his life on the assumption that he was what he was, that the violence and moral compromise of his world had shaped him beyond redemption. The possibility of transformation, of choosing to be someone different, felt both terrifying and impossibly appealing. "There's something else," Dominic said. "She doesn't know I'm thinking about this. She barely knows me. Then perhaps it's time to remedy that situation. How do I approach someone like her? How do I explain what I am, what I do?" Father Angelo stood and placed a weathered hand on Dominic's shoulder. "You start by being honest. Not about your business, perhaps, but about your intentions. You tell her what she means to you and let her decide if that's enough." After the priest left, Dominic sat alone in his office, the family Bible open before him once again. He picked up a pen and held it over the blank line next to his name, imagining the weight of that decision. The implications of binding himself to someone who lived in a completely different world. Then he set the pen aside and reached for his phone. It was time to see Elena again, and this time he would ask the question that had been burning in his chest since the moment he first saw her face. This time, he would ask her to take a chance on becoming something neither of them had ever imagined possible. Elena had never imagined that wealth could feel so intimidating. Standing before the wrought-iron gates of Dominic's estate in Bay Ridge, she felt like Alice approaching the rabbit, whole, aware that crossing this threshold would change her. Life in ways she couldn't predict or control. The mansion beyond the gates resembled something from a movie set. 3 stories of limestone and glass, surrounded by manicured gardens that probably employed more groundskeepers than Rosetti's had total employees. Security cameras tracked her movement with mechanical precision, and she could sense eyes watching from windows she couldn't see behind. Dominic had called the morning after their coffee conversation, his voice careful and formal as he asked if she would join him for dinner at his home. "I want you to see my world," he had said, "to understand what I'm offering before you make any decisions." Now standing at the entrance to that world, Elena wondered if understanding was possible or if she was simply walking into a beautiful trap. The gates opened silently, operated by someone Elena couldn't see. A black sedan waited in the circular driveway, its engine purring with expensive quiet. The driver who emerged wore a dark suit and moved with the controlled alertness she was beginning to recognize as the signature of Dominic's people. "Miss Martinez, I'm Tony Ricci. Mr. Torrino asked me to bring you up to the house." Elena had expected Dominic to greet her personally, and his absence felt like the first test in a series she was sure to fail. She slid into the sedan's leather interior, trying not to touch anything that looked irreplaceably expensive. The drive up to the main house took longer than seemed possible, winding through gardens that contained more varieties of flowers than Elena could name. Fountains sparkled in the afternoon sun, and she caught glimpses of a tennis court, a swimming pool, and what appeared to be a greenhouse that dwarfed the one behind Rosetti's. "First time here?" Tony asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Yes. Can be overwhelming. I remember my first visit, thought I'd walked into a palace or something." Elena appreciated his attempt to put her at ease, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of Dominic's wealth. This wasn't just money. This was power made manifest, influence converted into marble and gold. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing Marco Vitali, whom Elena recognized from the diner cleanup. His expression was carefully neutral as he ushered her into a foyer that could have housed her entire apartment. "Mr. Torrino is waiting in the garden room," Marco said, leading her through corridors lined with oil paintings and antique furniture. "He apologizes for not greeting you personally. Business call from the West Coast." Elena nodded, though she suspected the truth was more complex. Dominic was giving her time to absorb his world, to understand the magnitude of what he represented before they spoke again. The garden room turned out to be a glass-enclosed conservatory filled with exotic plants and comfortable seating arrangements. Dominic stood with his back to the entrance, speaking into a phone in low, controlled tones that suggested the conversation was both important and unpleasant. "No, Vincent, that's not how this works," he was saying. "You made your position clear at the warehouse. Now you live with the consequences." Elena froze at the mention of Vincent's name, remembering news reports about the shooting. She was hearing Dominic conduct the kind of business that normal people only read about in newspapers, and the reminder of his true nature sent a chill through her chest. Dominic ended the call and turned to face her, his expression softening the moment he saw her standing there. He wore dark slacks and a white shirt open at the collar, more casual than she had ever seen him, but his eyes held the same intensity that had captured her attention in the diner. "Elena, I'm sorry about that. Business doesn't always respect dinner schedules." "Dangerous business," Elena said quietly. Dominic studied her face, perhaps gauging whether the phone conversation had changed her perception of him. Yes, always. The Vincent you were talking to, is that the same Vincent from the warehouse shooting? You've been following the news. Hard not to, when you're involved. Dominic moved closer, his movements careful and deliberate. Does that frighten you? Elena considered the question seriously, standing in his beautiful, intimidating home, surrounded by evidence of wealth built on activities she couldn't fully comprehend. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something more complex, awareness of danger balanced by inexplicable trust. It should, she admitted. But no, not the way you mean. What does frighten you? Elena looked around the conservatory, taking in the carefully controlled environment where exotic plants thrived under artificial conditions. All of this. The idea that you could give me everything and I wouldn't know how to keep it. You wouldn't have to keep it. It would be yours. Nothing is really yours if you don't earn it. Dominic's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something deeper. Most people in my world have forgotten that principle. I'm not most people in your world. No, Dominic agreed, moving close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. You're not. That's why I needed you to see this place, to understand what you'd be accepting if you said yes. Said yes to what? Dominic reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering. To marrying me. The photographs arrived at Elena's apartment 3 days after she had fled Dominic's mansion, leaving his marriage proposal unanswered and his velvet ring box sitting abandoned on the conservatory table. She found the manila envelope slipped under her door when she returned from another sleepless shift at Rosetti's. Her name written across the front in block letters that revealed nothing about the sender. Inside were surveillance photos, dozens of them, taken with a telephoto lens from various angles and distances. Elena walking to work, Elena grocery shopping. Elena sitting alone in her apartment, visible through windows she had never thought to consider vulnerable. The images spanned several weeks, suggesting she had been watched long before she ever met Dominic Torrino. At the bottom of the envelope, wrapped in tissue paper like a gift, lay a single red rose. Its petals had been systematically destroyed, pulled apart and rearranged to form a pattern Elena didn't immediately recognize. Only when she spread the pieces across her kitchen table did the message become clear. The rose had been reassembled into the shape of a cross, a warning, a threat, a promise of violence disguised as romantic gesture. Elena's hands shook as she gathered the photographs, noting how the angles revealed intimate details of her daily routine. Someone had studied her movements with professional thoroughness, learned her schedule, identified her vulnerabilities. The girl who had spent her entire life being invisible now discovered that invisibility was an illusion. She had simply been watched by people skilled enough to remain unseen themselves. Her phone rang, the sound sharp in the silence of her apartment. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something in her chest told her she should answer. ELENA MARTINEZ. The voice was smooth, cultured, carrying the faint accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. Who is this? Vincent Castellano. I believe we have mutual interests to discuss. Elena sank onto her couch, the destroyed rose petals still scattered across her table. Vincent Castellano, the name from Dominic's phone conversation. The man whose war with the Torrino family had started with bullets in a warehouse and continued with surveillance photos under her door. I don't know what you're talking about. Please, Miss Martinez. We both know that's not true. You've become quite important to Dominic Torrino, haven't you? Important enough that he's willing to make himself vulnerable for your sake. Elena's throat felt dry. What do you want? To meet with you. To explain certain facts about your situation that Mr. Torrino may have neglected to mention. I'm not involved in your business. Vincent's laugh was soft and genuinely amused. My dear girl, the moment you caught Dominic's attention, you became the most involved person in Brooklyn. The question is whether you understand the rules of the game you're now playing. Elena looked at the photographs spread across her table, evidence that she had been playing this game without knowing it for weeks. What rules? Meet me tomorrow evening. Gino's restaurant on 86th Street, 8 o'clock. Come alone, and I'll explain everything you need to know about the man who wants to marry you. The line went dead before Elena could respond. She sat holding the silent phone, staring at images of herself taken by people who meant her harm, wondering how her invisible life had become the center of a war between the most dangerous men in New York. That evening, Elena walked through Brooklyn Heights as darkness settled over the city, her usual route to the promenade where she often went to think. The harbor spread out before her, lights twinkling across the water like earthbound stars. But tonight the familiar view brought no comfort. She wasn't surprised when Dominic appeared beside her at the railing, moving with the silent grace that seemed to be his natural state. He wore a long coat against the October chill, but his eyes held a warmth that had become achingly familiar. "You got Vincent's message," he said. "Not bothering with pleasantries. You were having me watched. Protected. There's a difference." Elena turned to face him, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the railing with controlled force. "Protected from what?" "From exactly what happened today. Vincent Castellano doesn't make social calls, Elena. He identifies weaknesses and exploits them. And I'm your weakness." Dominic's silence was answer enough. Elena felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration at the thought that she, invisible, forgettable ELENA MARTINEZ, could be considered a weakness by the most powerful man she had ever met. "He wants to meet with me tomorrow night." "Absolutely not. He said he would explain things about you." "Things you haven't told me." Dominic turned to face her fully, his expression intense. "There's nothing Vincent can tell you that I won't tell you myself. If you ask, then tell me now. Tell me why someone like Vincent Castellano considers someone like me worth threatening." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, watching ships move across the distant harbor. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession, because in 35 years of living in a world where everything is negotiable, where everyone has a price, I've never met someone I couldn't bear to lose. And that makes you the most dangerous weapon anyone could use against me. Elena's diary had always been her most private possession, a leather-bound notebook she had kept hidden in various places throughout her adult life. Tonight, she wrote by lamplight in her small apartment, the words flowing faster than they had in years. October 15th. I don't know who I am anymore. 3 weeks ago, I was nobody. I served coffee to people who didn't see me, went home to an empty apartment, fell asleep, knowing that tomorrow would be exactly like today. Now I'm apparently important enough to be threatened by Vincent Castellano and protected by Dominic Torrino, and I can't figure out which of those things terrifies me more. Dominic asked me to marry him. He opened a velvet box and offered me a life I've never dreamed of having, and all I could do was run away like a frightened child. But what else could I do? How do you say yes to someone when you don't understand why they're asking? He says I'm his weakness, that in 35 years he's never met someone he couldn't bear to lose. But how can you lose something you never really had? How can someone like him be vulnerable to someone like me? Elena set down her pen and touched the scar along her jaw, the physical reminder of everything that made her different. In the mirror across her small room, she saw what she had always seen: plain features, unremarkable brown hair, the kind of face that disappeared in crowds. Nothing about her reflection suggested she could be the center of anyone's world, much less a world as dangerous and complex as Dominic's. But when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the weight of his gaze, the way he had looked at her in the diner with something approaching reverence. No one had ever looked at ELENA MARTINEZ that way. No one had ever seen her as worthy of protection or devotion, or the kind of love that came with velvet ring boxes and promises of forever. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Elena glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. Too late for casual conversation. But the caller ID showed Dominic's number, and despite her confusion about everything else, she found herself answering without hesitation. "I can't sleep," his voice came through the line. "Rough with exhaustion or emotion. Neither can I. Are you going to meet with Vincent tomorrow?" Elena had been wrestling with that decision all evening. Every rational instinct told her to stay away from Vincent Castellano, to refuse involvement in a conflict she didn't understand. But another part of her, the part that had spent years accepting other people's definitions of who she was, wanted to hear what Vincent had to say about Dominic, about the world she was being asked to enter. "I don't know. Elena, Vincent is dangerous in ways you can't imagine. He doesn't just kill people who oppose him. He destroys them. He finds what they love most and takes it away piece by piece until they beg for death. And you've never done anything like that." The silence that followed her question was answer enough. Elena had known, intellectually, that Dominic's world involved violence. But hearing him acknowledge it, even through silence, made the reality more immediate and personal. "I've done things I'm not proud of," Dominic said finally. "Things that were necessary to protect my family, my territory, my people. But I've never taken pleasure in causing pain, and Vincent does. Vincent enjoys breaking beautiful things. It's what makes him dangerous, and it's why I can't let you anywhere near him." Eleanor stood and walked to her window, looking down at the empty street below. Somewhere in the darkness, she knew Dominic's people were watching, protecting her from threats she was only beginning to understand. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it felt like another layer of the cage being built around her freedom. What if I want to meet with him? What if I want to hear what he has to say? "Then I'll be there with you," he said to come alone. "Vincent says a lot of things. Most of them are lies designed to give him an advantage." Elena pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching her breath fog the window. "How do I know you're not doing the same thing? How do I know this isn't all some elaborate game between you and Vincent, and I'm just the prize you're fighting over?" "Because," Dominic said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it, "if this were a game, I would have chosen a different prize. Someone who could help me win, who brought connections or money or power to the table. Someone who made sense, instead of someone like me. Instead of someone who makes me want to be better than I am. Someone who makes me question everything I thought I knew about what matters in life." Elena felt tears gathering behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of being truly seen by another person for the first time in her adult life. "I love you," she whispered into the phone, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Elena, I love you, and I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to love someone like you, or how to let someone like you love someone like me." "We figure it out together," Dominic said. "That's what people do when they love each other. They figure it out as they go." The hospital bracelet had yellowed with age, but Elena could still read her name, printed in faded blue ink. Martinez, Elena, age 7, emergency contact, none. She held the small plastic band that had encircled her wrist for 3 weeks following the accident that changed her life. The accident that had given her the scar she wore like a brand of unworthiness. She hadn't planned to show Dominic the bracelet or to tell him the story it represented. But sitting in his study, the morning after their phone conversation, surrounded by the evidence of his wealth and power, Elena felt compelled to offer him the truth about who she really was beneath the surface he found so compelling. "I was 7, she began, turning the bracelet over in her fingers. "My mother was working late at a factory job, and she'd left me with Mrs. Kowalski from downstairs. Mrs. Kowalski had been drinking. She always drank when her husband worked nights, and she fell asleep watching television." Dominic listened without interruption, his dark eyes focused entirely on Elena's face. They sat in comfortable chairs before the fireplace, coffee cooling in forgotten cups, the morning sun streaming through tall windows that overlooked his private gardens. "I got hungry and tried to make myself something to eat. I was tall for my age, but not tall enough to reach the cabinet where the bread was kept. So I climbed onto the counter and I reached up and I knocked over a drinking glass. Elena's fingers traced the length of her scar, a gesture so automatic she barely realized she was doing it. It shattered when it hit the floor, and I jumped down to clean it up before Mrs. Kowalski woke up. I was trying to pick up the pieces with my hands, and one of them was larger than I realized, sharper than I expected. The scar, Dominic said quietly. The scar. It cut deep from my temple to my jaw. There was so much blood, and Mrs. Kowalski was too drunk to drive, and my mother didn't have a car. By the time the ambulance came, I'd lost consciousness. Elena set the hospital bracelet on the table between them, a small piece of plastic that contained one of the defining moments of her childhood. 17 stitches. The doctor said I was lucky it missed my eye, lucky it didn't cut any major nerves. Lucky. What happened after? My mother couldn't afford plastic surgery to minimize the scarring, couldn't afford the follow-up treatments that might have helped. I went back to school with a face that looked like someone had drawn a line across it with a marker, and the other children made sure I understood that I was different now, damaged. Eleanor looked at Dominic, trying to gauge his reaction to her story. His expression was carefully controlled, but she could see anger building behind his eyes, not at her, but at the circumstances that had shaped her childhood, at the people who had made her feel less than whole. The bracelet says, emergency contact. None. And Dominic observed, my mother was at work when it happened. Mrs. Kowalski was too drunk to remember her phone number. For 3 weeks, while I was in the hospital recovering from the surgery and fighting off infection, I had no visitors except the nurses and doctors who were paid to take care of me. 3 weeks. You were alone for 3 weeks. I learned to be alone. I learned that I couldn't depend on other people to take care of me, that I had to be strong enough to survive whatever happened. And I learned that some kinds of damage never really heal, no matter how much time passes. Dominic stood abruptly and began pacing the length of his study, his controlled composure finally cracking. Elena watched him move with the restless energy of someone trying to contain violence, and she realized that her story had affected him more deeply than she had anticipated. "Where is Mrs. Kowalski now?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Dead. Liver failure about 10 years ago." "Good." The single word carried such venom that Eleanor felt a chill run through her chest. This was the man Vincent Castellano feared, the man whose enemies disappeared without explanation. For a moment, she saw past the gentleness he showed her to the capacity for violence that made him powerful. Dominic. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression shifting as he recognized her fear. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you. You didn't frighten me. You reminded me of what you're capable of. Does that change how you feel about me?" Elena considered the question seriously. The man who had just wished death on a long-dead alcoholic was the same man who had fallen to his knees in a destroyed diner, who had offered her marriage and protection and a love she had never thought possible. "No," she said finally. "It makes me understand why you were able to see me when no one else could." "What do you mean?" "Damage recognizes damaged. Survivors recognize survivors. You looked at me and saw someone who had learned to be strong in the face of things that should have broken her. Just like you." Dominic knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his touch gentle despite the violence she knew those hands were capable of. "You're not damaged. Elena, you're marked by what you've survived, but you're not broken." "Neither are you," she replied, and watched something shift in his expression, surprise, recognition. Perhaps the beginning of forgiveness for sins he had never spoken aloud. The wedding invitation was elegant in its simplicity, cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing, Elena's name written in careful calligraphy beside Dominic's. She had spent hours choosing the design with a wedding planner who tactfully ignored the obvious security concerns surrounding the event. The invitations represented hope made tangible, a future Elena was finally ready to embrace. Now, staring at the charred remains scattered across her apartment floor, she felt that hope crumble into ash and fear. The fire had been small but precise, contained to the box of invitations sitting on her kitchen table. Someone had broken into her apartment with surgical efficiency, destroyed the symbol of her upcoming marriage, and left without disturbing anything else. The message was clear. Elena's future with Dominic was an illusion that could be burned away at any moment. Elena's hands shook as she gathered the fragments, noting how the flames had consumed her name first, leaving only scattered letters of Dominic's surname. Even in destruction, the invitations seemed to suggest that she was the expendable element in this equation. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Consider this a final warning. Some unions are too dangerous to allow. Elena sank onto her couch, still holding pieces of what should have been the happiest announcement of her life. She had agreed to marry Dominic 3 days ago, accepting his proposal in a moment of absolute certainty that their love could overcome any obstacle. Now she wondered if love was enough to survive in a world where enemies could reach into her most private spaces and destroy her dreams. While she slept, the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her door made Elena freeze. The building security was minimal, and she had learned to recognize the distinctive patterns of her neighbor's movements. These footsteps were wrong, too purposeful, too quiet, belonging to someone who moved with professional intent. Elena reached for her phone to call Dominic, then realized that involving him might escalate the situation beyond control. If Vincent Castellano's people were outside her door, bringing Dominic into the conflict might transform a warning into a war. Instead, she moved quietly to her bedroom and retrieved the small pistol Dominic had insisted she carry, a compact weapon she had practiced with at a private shooting range but never expected to use. The weight of it in her hand felt foreign and terrible, a reminder of how far her life had traveled from invisible waitress to potential target of organized crime. The footsteps stopped outside her door. Elena heard the soft scraping of metal against metal, the distinctive sound of someone working on her locks with professional tools. Her apartment's security had always been an illusion, and now that illusion was being systematically dismantled by people who meant her harm. Elena positioned herself behind the kitchen counter, the gun held in both hands the way Dominic's security instructor had taught her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. Fear had been her companion for so many years that she knew how to function despite it. The door opened silently, revealing 2 figures in dark clothing who moved with the coordinated precision of a professional team. Elena recognized neither face, but their body language spoke of experience with violence, of men accustomed to taking what they wanted without resistance. "Elena Martinez?" The first man spoke with a slight accent, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that suggested he had done this many times before. "Who's asking?" "Someone who wants to have a conversation with you about your poor choice in romantic partners." Eleanor kept the gun trained on the first man while tracking the second with her peripheral vision. "I'm not interested in conversations that begin with breaking and entering. Mr. Castellano thought you might be more receptive to discussing your situation in private." Mr. Castellano was wrong. The second man moved slightly to Elena's left, trying to flank her position behind the counter. Elena shifted her aim toward him, and both men froze at the sight of her weapon. "You don't want to do this, lady," the first man said, his tone shifting from casual confidence to genuine concern. "You pull that trigger, and this becomes something bigger than just a conversation. It became something bigger the moment you burned my wedding invitations." Elena's voice carried a strength that surprised even her. The invisible girl, who had spent years accepting whatever treatment the world offered, had been replaced by a woman who refused to be. Intimidated in her own home, "Mr. Castellano just wants you to understand the consequences of your choices," the second man said. "Marriage to Dominic Torrino makes you a target for every enemy he's made in 20 years of business. Then I guess I'd better learn to be a difficult target." The sound of approaching sirens filled the brief silence that followed Elena's words. The two men exchanged glances, their professional calm replaced by urgent concern about escape routes and response times. "This isn't over," the first man said, backing toward the door. "Yes, it is," Elena replied, her gun still trained on both intruders. "Tell Vincent Castellano that if he wants to discuss my wedding plans, he can make an appointment like a civilized human being." After the men disappeared into the stairwell, Elena remained frozen behind her counter, adrenaline and determination warring in her chest. She had just faced down Vincent Castellanos' enforcers, and more importantly, she had done it without calling Dominic for rescue. For the first time since accepting his proposal, Elena felt ready to become his wife. Dominic's grandfather's gun had seen 3 generations of Torrino men through various conflicts, its pearl handle worn smooth by decades of use. The weapon lay open on the felt-lined case on Dominic's desk, each component cleaned and oiled with the reverence due a family heirloom. Engraved along the barrel in flowing script were the words "Onore e Familia," honor and family, the principles that had guided Torrino decisions since their arrival in America. Now, as Dominic reassembled the pistol with practiced efficiency, those principles felt more relevant than they had in years. Elena sat across from him in the study, her own smaller weapon disassembled on the desk as she learned the ritual of maintenance that might one day save her life. 3 days had passed since the break-in at her apartment, and rather than retreat from the escalating conflict with Vincent Castellano, she had insisted on learning to defend herself more effectively. "The gun is not the weapon," Dominic said, echoing the words his grandfather had taught him at age 12. "The mind is the weapon. The gun is simply the tool the mind employs." Elena nodded, her fingers working with growing confidence as she cleaned the barrel of her pistol. "Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man. He was a practical man. He understood that in our world, the difference between life and death often comes down to preparation and willingness. To act when action is required. Is that why you've been having me followed by 3 different security teams instead of just one?" Dominic looked up from his work, surprised by Elena's awareness of the protection details he had thought were invisible. "How did you know?" "The same way I knew Vincent's men were watching me before they broke into my apartment. When you spend your life being invisible, you notice when other people are trying to be invisible too." Elena's observation reminded Dominic of why she had become so important to him. Her years of being overlooked had developed in her a heightened awareness of her surroundings that rivaled the skills of trained operatives. She noticed details that others missed, saw patterns that escaped casual observation. "I want to be part of planning the response to Vincent," Elena said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she had demonstrated during the break-in. "Not just protected from it, part of it. Elena, this isn't your fight. It became my fight when Vincent made me a target. It became my fight when he threatened our future together." She set down her cleaning cloth and looked directly at Dominic. "I'm not asking you to put me in danger. I'm asking you to let me help end the danger." Dominic finished reassembling his grandfather's pistol and held it up to the light, checking the alignment of the sight. The weapon represented everything his family had built in America: power earned through violence, respect maintained through the threat of retribution, survival achieved through superior preparation and ruthless execution. "What do you have in mind?" "Vincent thinks I'm just a weakness he can exploit, a soft target he can use to hurt you. But what if that perception became an advantage instead of a liability?" Elena's suggestion intrigued Dominic more than it should have. Involving a civilian in Mafia business violated every principle of operational security he had learned over 20 years of leadership. But Elena wasn't really a civilian anymore. She had become a target, which meant she was already part of the conflict, whether he acknowledged it or not. "Explain." "Vincent wants to meet with me. He's been trying to arrange that meeting since the first day we talked. What if we let him think he's succeeded? What if we let him believe he's isolated me from your protection?" "Absolutely not. Vincent doesn't make social calls." "Elena, He arranges meetings so he can control the circumstances of violence. Then we control the circumstances. First, Elena's calm confidence as she discussed strategy for dealing with a dangerous criminal reminded Dominic of his grandfather's stories about his grandmother, a woman who had managed household finances that included both legitimate businesses and illegal operations, who had entertained police commissioners and federal judges at dinner parties while laundering money through her charity work. You're talking about using yourself as bait. I'm talking about using Vincent's assumptions about me against him. He sees me as Dominic Torrino's helpless girlfriend. He doesn't see me as someone who survived 7 years old alone in a hospital, who worked 3 jobs to put myself through community college, who faced down his enforcers with a gun I'd never fired outside a shooting range. Dominic studied Elena's face, noting the determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw that suggested her mind was already made up regardless of his approval. She had moved beyond asking for his permission and was now seeking his partnership. What exactly are you proposing? Vincent wants to meet at Gino's restaurant tomorrow night. We let him think I'm coming alone and scared. But instead of trying to prevent the meeting, we use it to end this war on our terms. And if something goes wrong, if Vincent decides to kill you instead of trying to use you. Elena picked up her reassembled pistol and checked the action with movements that were becoming more natural each day. Then you'll have taught me well enough to make sure he doesn't succeed. The DNA test results arrived in a nondescript manila envelope, delivered to Elena's apartment by a courier who required no signature and asked no questions. Inside, printed on laboratory letterhead that meant nothing to Elena, was a document that would redefine everything she thought she knew about herself. Subject, Elena Carmen Martinez. Biological father, Anthony Tony Benedetto, deceased. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Elena stared at the name, trying to reconcile it with her understanding of her own history. Her mother had always claimed that Elena's father was a construction worker who had disappeared before Elena was born. A man whose name Carmen had refused to reveal out of shame or anger, or some combination of both, Anthony Benedetto. The name meant nothing to Elena, but something about it felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. She was still holding the test results when Dominic arrived that evening, using the key she had given him after the break-in. He found her sitting at her small kitchen table, the documents spread before her like evidence of a crime she hadn't known she'd committed. "Elena, what's wrong?" Instead of answering, she handed him the DNA report and watched his face change as he read. First confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been fear or wonder or both. "Tony Benedetto," Dominic said quietly, setting the document on the table with careful precision. "You know that name. I know that name." Dominic pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. Anthony Benedetto was the head of one of the most respected crime families in Brooklyn. He died 15 years ago in a car accident that everyone suspected wasn't accidental. Elena felt the world tilt around her, familiar certainties sliding away like sand. "Crime family? Your father wasn't just connected to our world, Elena. He was royalty in our world." The Benedetto family controlled the waterfront unions, most of the legitimate construction contracts, and half the judges in Brooklyn family court. "That's impossible. My mother worked in factories. We lived above a hardware store. We had nothing because Tony was married," Dominic said gently. "Married to the daughter of another crime family, with 2 legitimate sons who were being groomed to take over his operations. Your mother would have been his mistress, someone he cared about but couldn't publicly acknowledge." Eleanor stood abruptly and walked to her window, looking down at the Brooklyn streets where she had grown up invisible and forgotten. "Why now? Why would someone send me this information now?" "Because someone wants you to know who you really are. Someone who understands that Tony, Benedetto's daughter, has a legitimate claim to power and respect in our world, or someone who wants to use that information against us." Dominic joined her at the window, his reflection visible in the glass beside hers. There's more, isn't there? More you haven't told me. Elena retrieved an envelope from her bedroom, one that had been delivered with the DNA results. Inside were copies of documents she had never seen. Medical records from her childhood accident, police reports, insurance claims. But these weren't the versions Elena remembered from her mother's explanations. The accident that gave me this scar, Elena said, touching her cheek. It wasn't an accident. Dominic took the police report and read with growing tension. Someone tried to kill you. A 7-year-old child. The broken glass wasn't from a drinking glass I knocked over. It was from a window that someone threw a brick through. The brick had a note attached, "Benedetto bastards die young." Jesus Christ, my mother lied to protect me. She told me I had fallen, that I had been clumsy, that I was responsible for my own disfigurement. She let me grow up thinking I was damaged and forgettable, instead of telling me I was the target of an assassination attempt. Elena's hands shook as she processed the implications of her mother's deception. Dominic Martinez had sacrificed her daughter's self-worth to keep her safe, had allowed Elena to believe she was worthless rather than risk her discovery as Tony Benedetto's heir. Your appearance, Dominic said slowly. The way you learn to be invisible. Your mother taught you that deliberately. She knew that if I looked like Tony Benedetto's daughter, if I acted like Tony Benedetto's daughter, someone would eventually figure out who I was and finish what they started when I was 7. That's why you caught my attention so quickly. I was seeing past the camouflage to something I recognized without understanding why. Elena turned to face Dominic, seeing her own reflection in his dark eyes. What does this mean for us? For our future? It means you're not just Elena Martinez anymore. You're Elena Benedetto, legitimate heir to one of the most powerful crime families in Brooklyn. It means Vincent Castellano isn't just afraid of losing to me. He's afraid of facing a united Torrino-Benedetto alliance. And it means, Elena said, understanding flooding through her like cold water, that our marriage isn't just about love anymore. It's about power. It's about uniting two families that together could control most of organized crime in New York. Dominic nodded grimly. Which makes us either the most powerful couple in the city or the biggest target for everyone who profits from keeping the families divided. The letters were hidden in a shoebox at the back of Carmen Martinez's bedroom closet, discovered by Elena 3 days after learning her true heritage. She had returned to the apartment above Murphy's hardware store for the first time in years, searching for any evidence that might explain her mother's deceptions and choices. The shoebox contained 15 years of correspondence between Carmen and Tony Benedetto, written in careful Spanish and English that revealed a relationship far more complex than Elena had ever imagined. The earliest letters, dated shortly after Elena's birth, were love letters filled with promises and dreams of a future together. My dearest Carmen, I know I cannot give you the life you deserve, the public recognition of our love that you have earned. But please believe that Elena is the greatest gift you could have given me. When I look at her photographs, I see hope for something better than the violence that has defined my family for so many years. As Elena read through the correspondence, the letters evolved from romantic devotion to practical concerns about safety and security. Tony's handwriting grew more urgent, his language more direct, as external threats to Carmen and Elena became impossible to ignore. Carmen. The attempt on Elena was not random. My enemies have discovered her existence and see her as a way to hurt me. You must take the steps we discussed. Make her invisible. Make her forgettable. It is the only way to keep her alive until she is old enough to protect herself. I'm arranging for money to be deposited monthly into the account we established. Use it for Elena's education, for her safety, for whatever she needs. But never let her know where it comes from. If she discovers who I am, she becomes a target again. Elena's hands trembled as she read about the elaborate fiction her parents had constructed around her childhood. The accident with broken glass had been carefully staged to explain her scars while concealing the real attack. Her family's poverty had been deliberate camouflage, designed to make her appear unimportant to anyone watching. For Tony Benedetto's illegitimate child, even her mother's apparent indifference had been performed love, a sacrifice Carmen had made to ensure Elena's survival. The final letter in the collection was dated just weeks before Tony's death in the car. Accident that may not have been accidental. Carmen, if something happens to me, there are people who will help Elena when she is ready. Father Angelo at St. Anthony's knows the truth about her parentage. Marco Santini at First Brooklyn Bank has access to accounts established for her education and future security. Most importantly, if she ever needs protection or guidance in our world, she can trust the Torrino family. Dominic Torrino is a man of honor who will respect the alliance between our families. Tell Elena, when she is old enough to understand, that I loved her more than my own life. That every choice I made was designed to give her the freedom to choose her own path when the time came. She is a Benedetto, but she need not be bound by the limitations that name has always carried. With all my love and devotion, Tony Elena set the letter aside and reached for her phone, dialing the number for St. Anthony's Church that she found written on several of the envelopes. Father Angelo, this is ELENA MARTINEZ. I think we need to talk. 2 hours later, Elena sat in the priest's modest office, surrounded by evidence of a life dedicated to serving others. Father Angelo Benedetto, she now understood the shared surname was no coincidence, was Tony's younger brother, a man who had chosen the priesthood over the family business, but had never stopped loving the brother who chose differently. He watched you from a distance your entire childhood, Father Angelo explained. Every school play, every graduation, every milestone. He was there in the back rows, making sure you were safe and proud of who you were becoming. Why didn't he ever approach me? Because approaching you would have signed your death warrant. Tony's enemies knew he cared about you, but they couldn't be certain you were important enough to him to risk using you as a weapon. As long as you remained invisible, remained unacknowledged, you remained safe. Elena thought about all the times she had felt abandoned, forgotten, worth nothing to anyone. I spent my whole life thinking, no one loved me? You spent your whole life being loved so completely that two people sacrificed their own happiness to keep you alive. Father Angelo opened a safe behind his desk and withdrew a sealed envelope marked with Elena's name in Tony's familiar handwriting. He asked me to give you this when you were ready to know the truth. I think today might be that day. Inside the envelope was a key and a simple note. Storage Unit 247, Brooklyn Self-Storage, Atlantic Avenue. Everything you need to know about who you really are is waiting for you there. Choose your path wisely, but know that whatever you choose as my daughter and heir. Papa Elena held the key in her palm, feeling its weight like a promise or a threat. Somewhere across the city was a storage unit filled with the truth about her heritage, her legacy, and the power she had never known she possessed. What happens if I choose not to open it? She asked. Then you remain ELENA MARTINEZ, and no one can fault you for that choice. And if I do open it? Father Angelo smiled sadly. Then you become Elena Benedetto, with all the privileges and dangers that name carries. And you must decide whether to use that power to build something better or to continue the cycles of violence that have defined our families for generations. The fake death certificate bore Elena's name in official typeface, complete with forged signatures and authentic-looking seals that would pass casual inspection. Dr. Michael Chen had created the document with the kind of professional expertise that came from years of providing similar services to people who needed to disappear temporarily or permanently. Elena stared at her own death certificate, feeling the surreal weight of planning her own funeral. According to the document, ELENA MARTINEZ had died in a car accident on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, her body burned beyond recognition, dental records destroyed in the fire. It was a perfect death, tragic enough to be believable, complete enough to discourage investigation. This feels wrong, Elena said. setting the certificate on Dominic's dining room table where maps and surveillance photos were spread like the planning materials for a military operation. "It feels wrong, because you're a good person," Dominic replied, checking the action on a pistol he had cleaned 3 times in the past hour. "Good people don't usually plan elaborate deceptions involving their own deaths." Marco Vitali entered the dining room, carrying a cup of coffee and an expression of professional concern. Over the past week, he had evolved from viewing Elena as an unwelcome complication to respecting her as a strategic asset. But he still questioned the wisdom of involving her directly in the confrontation with Vincent Castellano. "The funeral arrangements are confirmed," Marco reported. "St. Mary's Cemetery, plot 847. Father Angelo will perform the service. Guest list includes representatives from every major family in Brooklyn, including Vincent's people, especially Vincent's people. He'll want to confirm that Dominic Torrino's weakness is genuinely eliminated." Elena walked to the window overlooking Dominic's gardens, trying to imagine what it would feel like to attend her own funeral, to watch people mourn a death that never happened. The plan they had developed was elegant in its simplicity. Elena would appear to die in an accident. Vincent would believe his primary weapon against Dominic was neutralized, and in his moment of perceived victory, he would reveal the full extent of his conspiracy against the Torrino family. "What if he doesn't take the bait?" Elena asked. "What if Vincent is too smart to believe I'm really dead? Then we'll know we're dealing with someone more dangerous than we anticipated," Dominic said. "But Vincent's ego is his weakness. He needs to believe he's won, that he's outsmarted me. Your apparent death will give him that satisfaction." Elena touched the necklace she wore beneath her shirt, a small silver cross that had belonged to her mother, one of the few possessions she intended to keep with her during the days she would be officially dead. The weight of it against her skin reminded her that she was taking a risk, not just with her own life, but with the future she and Dominic were trying to build together. "How long will I have to stay dead?" "No more than 72 hours, Marco said. "Vincent will move quickly once he thinks you're eliminated. He's been planning something big, waiting for the right moment to strike against our family. Your death will convince him that moment has arrived." Dominic joined Elena at the window, his reflection visible beside hers in the glass. "Are you certain you want to do this? Once we implement the plan, there's no calling it off. You'll be Elena Benedetto, officially dead until we can expose Vincent's conspiracy and neutralize the threat he represents." Elena considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, she had been invisible by choice, comfortable in her anonymity, content to serve coffee and live unnoticed. Now she was preparing to fake her own death in service of a war between crime families, fully embracing the dangerous world she had accidentally entered. "I'm certain," she said finally, "but I want something in return. Name it. When this is over, when Vincent is no longer a threat, I want to use my inheritance from Tony Benedetto to do something constructive. Something that helps people instead of hurting them." Marco raised an eyebrows. "The Benedetto assets include some questionable enterprises. Then we'll make them less questionable. Money laundering operations can become legitimate financial services. Protection rackets can become actual security companies. Drug territories can become community development projects." Dominic smiled, recognizing in Elena's words the same vision of transformation that had motivated his own evolution from purely violent enforcer to strategic leader. "You want to reform organized crime from the inside. I want to prove that being Tony Benedetto's daughter means something more than inheriting his capacity for violence." Elena picked up the fake death certificate and folded it carefully, placing it in the purse she would carry to her staged accident. Tonight, ELENA MARTINEZ would die in a car fire on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. Tomorrow, Elena Benedetto would rise from those ashes to claim her birthright and end Vincent Castellano's war on her terms. "Are you ready?" Dominic asked. Elena kissed him softly, tasting the promise of their future beyond the immediate danger. "I've been ready my whole life." I just didn't know what I was preparing for. The recording device was no larger than a button, its sophisticated electronics disguised as an ordinary piece of jewelry. Elena clipped it to the inside of her jacket collar, the tiny microphone positioned to capture conversation, while remaining invisible to casual observation. The device could record for 6 hours and transmit in real time to receivers positioned throughout Vincent Castellano's restaurant. Elena stood in the abandoned warehouse where she had been officially dead for 18 hours, checking her appearance in a cracked mirror that reflected the dim light of a single bulb. She looked different somehow, not just because of the careful makeup that concealed her distinctive scar, but because of something fundamental in her posture and expression. The invisible girl was gone, replaced by a woman who understood her own power. Audio check. Marco's voice came through the tiny earpiece hidden beneath her hair. "I hear you clearly," Elena whispered. "Remember, Vincent is going to try to unbalance you, to make you emotional or careless. He'll probably tell you things about Dominic's past, about your father's death, about the violence that shaped our world. Don't let him see that any of it affects you." Elena nodded, though Marco couldn't see her. Over the past 24 hours, she had studied everything available about Vincent Castellano, his habits, his psychology, his methods of intimidation and control. He was a man who enjoyed breaking people slowly, who found satisfaction in watching hope die in his victim's eyes. Tonight, she would give him the performance of vulnerability he expected, while recording every word he spoke about his plans to destroy the Torrino family. Dominic entered the warehouse, moving with the controlled urgency of someone operating under extreme time pressure. Elena's funeral had been that morning, attended by representatives from every major crime family in Brooklyn. According to Marco's sources, Vincent had smiled during the service, barely containing his satisfaction at Elena's apparent death. "Last chance to change your mind," Dominic said, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "Vincent Castellano has been trying to hurt you by threatening me for weeks. Tonight, I'm going to let him think he's succeeded. And then I'm going to destroy him with his own words." Dominic kissed her with an intensity that spoke of fear carefully controlled, love tested by danger, and absolute faith in her ability to survive whatever came next. If anything goes wrong, nothing will go wrong. Vincent thinks he's meeting with a terrified woman who's desperate enough to betray you for her own safety. He has no idea he's meeting with Tony Benedetto's daughter. Elena had spent hours preparing for this deception, studying surveillance footage of herself from before she knew about her heritage, learning to recreate the body language of someone who believed she was powerless. Tonight, she would be the invisible girl one final time, using that persona as a weapon against Vincent's expectations. The drive to Gino's restaurant took 20 minutes through Brooklyn streets that had become familiar territory over the past month. Elena sat in the back of an unmarked sedan, driven by one of Marco's most trusted operatives, surrounded by the invisible network of protection that would ensure Vincent couldn't simply kill her and dispose of the evidence. But the real protection wasn't the armed men positioned throughout the neighborhood or the recording equipment that would capture Vincent's confession. The real protection was Elena's transformation from victim to predator, from target to hunter. Gino's restaurant occupied a corner building in Bensonhurst, its exterior modest enough to attract no attention from law enforcement or rival families. Inside, Elena knew Vincent waited with whatever associates he trusted enough to include in his conspiracy against Dominic. She would be walking into a room full of dangerous men who believed she was already dead, who thought they were meeting with a ghost, desperate enough to trade information for her life. Elena checked the recording device one final time, feeling its slight weight against her collar like a talisman. Everything Vincent said in the next hour would be preserved, transmitted in real time to Dominic and Marco, recorded for future use in neutralizing the threat he represented. "Target acquired," came Marco's voice through her earpiece as Vincent's distinctive figure appeared in the restaurant's front window. Elena took a deep breath, summoning the invisible girl she had been for most of her life, preparing to resurrect ELENA MARTINEZ one final time in service of Elena Benedetto's future. She opened the car door and stepped into the Brooklyn night, walking toward a confrontation that would either destroy Vincent Castellano's power or cost Elena everything she had fought to build. Behind her, invisible in the darkness, Dominic's people moved into position. Ahead of her, Vincent Castellano waited with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Between them, Elena Benedetto prepared to prove that the most dangerous weapon in any war was an enemy who refused to stay dead. Vincent Castellano rose from his chair as Elena entered Gino's restaurant, his expression shifting from smug satisfaction to genuine shock as he realized the woman he thought he had killed was standing before him very much alive. The recording device captured every word of what followed, preserving his confession for posterity and legal proceedings. "Impossible," Vincent breathed, his usual composure cracking like ice under pressure. "You're dead. I saw the death certificate. I attended your funeral. Did you really think it would be that easy?" Elena asked, allowing her natural voice to emerge for the first time in Vincent's presence. Gone was the frightened waitress persona she had maintained for weeks. In its place stood Elena Benedetto, daughter of a crime boss, heir to a legacy of power that Vincent was only beginning to understand. "Who are you?" "I'm the woman whose childhood you tried to end with broken glass and death threats. I'm the daughter of Tony Benedetto, the man you've been trying to replace for 15 years. And I'm the future wife of Dominic Torrino, which makes me your worst nightmare made manifest." Vincent's two associates reached for weapons, but Elena's movement was faster, more decisive. The small pistol appeared in her hand with fluid precision, trained on Vincent, while she maintained awareness of the other threats in the room. "I wouldn't recommend that," Elena said calmly. "This restaurant is currently surrounded by people who are very invested in my continued good health." Through the restaurant's front window, Vincent could see figures moving in the shadows, the subtle repositioning that indicated professional surveillance and containment. His trap had become Elena's stage, his moment of triumph transformed into his confession of conspiracy and attempted murder. "How long have you known?" Vincent asked, lowering his hands in reluctant acknowledgement of his disadvantage. "About my father. About your role in his death? About your 15-year campaign to eliminate anyone who might challenge your authority? Long enough to document everything you've done and prepare an appropriate response." Elena moved closer to Vincent's table, her weapon steady, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally embraced her true nature. The invisible girl was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood power and was prepared to use it. You killed Tony Benedetto because he represented legitimacy in our world. He was building alliances, reducing violence, creating stability that threatened your business model of chaos and intimidation. "Your father was weak," Vincent spat. "He thought he could reform our world from within, make it civilized and respectable. I showed him that some things never change. The confession tape is going to make fascinating listening for federal prosecutors," Elena observed. "Conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, probably enough RICO violations to put you away for multiple lifetimes." Vincent's expression shifted again, calculation replacing shock as he realized the full scope of Elena's deception. "You're wearing a wire. I'm wearing several recording devices, actually. This conversation is being transmitted in real time to very interested parties, including some people in federal law enforcement who have been trying to build a case against you for years." Elena reached into her jacket and withdrew a photograph, the surveillance image Vincent had sent to her apartment weeks earlier, showing her walking to work in apparent innocence and vulnerability. "This was your mistake," she said, placing the photograph on Vincent's table. "You revealed that you had been watching me, which meant you knew who I was long before I knew who I was." That suggested my father's death wasn't as accidental as it appeared. Prove it. I already have. Tony Benedetto's car was sabotaged with a device that federal investigators found but couldn't trace. Until tonight, your admission that you showed him some things never change provides the missing piece of evidence they needed to connect you to his murder. Through her earpiece, Elena heard Marco's voice. Federal units are moving into position. 30 seconds to breach. Elena allowed herself a small smile, the expression transforming her face from pretty to genuinely beautiful. Vincent, you made the same mistake that everyone else has made my entire life. You assumed that being invisible meant being powerless. What do you want? Justice for my father, safety for my future family, and an end to the violence that has defined our world for too long. The restaurant's front door exploded inward as federal agents flooded the space. Weapons drawn, voices shouting commands for everyone to remain still. Vincent Castellano, his associates and several other customers found themselves face down on the floor, while Elena stood calmly in the center of the chaos. Her own weapon lowered but ready. "Elena Benedetto," she said to the lead federal agent, extending her identification. "I believe you have some questions about Vincent Castellano's criminal enterprises." As handcuffs clicked around Vincent's wrists, Elena felt the weight of generations lifting from her shoulders. The cycle of violence that had claimed her father and threatened her future was finally broken, ended not with bullets, but with truth, strategy, and the courage to claim her birthright. She had proven that Tony Benedetto's daughter could indeed change their world from within. The wedding ring Elena wore was unlike any piece of jewelry she had ever imagined owning. Designed by Dominic's personal jeweler, it incorporated symbols from both their families. The Torrino crest intertwined with the Benedetto rose, diamonds and sapphires arranged to catch light like promises, made permanent in precious metal. The ring represented not just their marriage, but the union of two powerful families and the hope for something better than the violence that had defined their shared history. 6 months had passed since Vincent Castellano's arrest and subsequent cooperation with federal prosecutors. His testimony had dismantled several rival crime organizations while providing Elena and Dominic the peace they needed to build their life together. The invisible girl was now the most visible bride in Brooklyn. Her story of transformation from forgotten waitress to Mafia princess, capturing public imagination in ways that made Dominic both proud and protective. Elena stood before the mirror in the bridal suite at St. Anthony's Church, adjusting her veil while her reflection showed someone she was still learning to recognize. The scar along her jaw was visible, but no longer hidden, having become part of her story rather than something to be ashamed of. The wedding dress, custom designed in Italian silk, transformed her from pretty to genuinely radiant. "You look exactly like your father when he was proud of something," Father Angelo said, entering the suite to offer final blessings before the ceremony. Over the months since Elena had learned her true heritage, her uncle had become both spiritual advisor and connection to the family she had never known. "Do you think he would approve of this marriage?" Tony wrote about Dominic Torrino in several letters to your mother. He respected the young man's intelligence, his restraint, his potential to lead our world towards something better than endless violence. "I think he would be honored to see his daughter marry into the Torrino family." Through the window, Elena could see guests arriving for the ceremony. Representatives from crime families across the East Coast, federal judges who had known her father, business leaders whose enterprises touched both legitimate and illegitimate worlds. The wedding had become a statement about the future of organized crime in New York, a demonstration that power could be inherited and used for purposes beyond mere accumulation of wealth and influence. Marco Vitali entered the suite, carrying a small gift box. "From Dominic," he explained. "He wanted you to have this before the ceremony." Inside the box was a pendant on a delicate gold chain, a small key, identical to the one her father had left for the storage unit. but cast in precious metal and set with a single perfect diamond. The note attached read, "Elena, this represents the key to our future together, as your father's key was the key to understanding your past. Today, we begin writing a new chapter in both our family histories. With all my love, Dominic." Elena fastened the pendant around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her heart like a promise. The storage unit her father had left her contained more than documents and money. It had held the truth about who she was and who she could become. Today's key would unlock something different, a partnership based on love and mutual respect, a future built on transformation rather than tradition. "Are you ready?" Father Angelo asked. Elena looked once more in the mirror, seeing not the invisible girl of her past or even the powerful heiress of her present, but the woman she was becoming, someone strong enough to love and be loved, wise enough to use power responsibly, brave enough to change the world she was inheriting. The organ music began, signaling the start of the ceremony. Elena took Father Angelo's arm and walked toward the church doors, beyond which waited Dominic, their families, their future together. As the doors opened and she saw the assembled guests, including many who had once dismissed her as beneath notice, Elena felt the final transformation complete itself. She was no longer Elena Martinez, invisible waitress. She was no longer Elena Benedetto, hidden heiress. She was becoming Elena Torrino, partner to one of the most powerful men in New York, ready to help him build something worthy of the love that had brought them together. The church was filled with flowers, music, and hundreds of people whose lives would be affected by the union taking place. But Elena's attention focused entirely on Dominic, waiting at the altar in a black tuxedo that made him look both dangerous and devoted. When their eyes met across the length of the church, Elena saw in his expression the same recognition that had passed between them in the destroyed diner months earlier. The recognition of two people who had found in each other something they hadn't known they were searching for. She walked toward him with the confidence of a woman who had learned that being wanted was not about being perfect, but about being authentic, strong, and brave enough to claim the love she deserved. The business card felt substantial in Elena's hands, its cream-colored stock and gold lettering reflecting the afternoon sunlight streaming through her office windows. "Elena Torrino, Community Advocate," it read, followed by contact information for the foundation she had established using her inheritance from Tony Benedetto's estate. 1 year of marriage had taught Elena that love was both simpler and more complex than she had imagined. Simpler because Dominic's devotion never wavered, never demanded explanation or justification. More complex because building a life together required daily choices about how to use their combined power and influence. The Benedetto Foundation occupied a renovated brownstone in Park Slope. Its programs focused on helping women who had been forgotten by traditional social services. Elena had discovered that her years of invisibility had taught her to recognize others who lived in society's margins. Women escaping domestic violence, immigrants struggling with language barriers, recovering addicts trying to rebuild their lives. Mrs. Torrino, Elena's assistant, Maria Santos, appeared in the doorway carrying a stack of grant applications. "The city councilwoman is here for your 3 o'clock appointment." Elena smiled at the title that still felt new after 12 months of marriage. Mrs. Torrino carried weight in New York political circles, opened doors that had been closed to Elena Martinez, commanded attention that had been denied to the invisible girl. But the title also carried responsibility, the obligation to use that access for purposes beyond personal gain. Councilwoman Patricia Williams entered Elena's office with the careful politeness of someone navigating relationships with powerful families. Elena had grown accustomed to this dynamic, the way people approached her with respect, tinged by uncertainty about exactly what kind of power she represented. "Thank you for seeing me," Patricia said, settling into the chair across from Elena's desk. "I wanted to discuss your proposal for the women's shelter expansion. For the next hour, they reviewed plans for converting 3 abandoned buildings in Brooklyn into housing for women transitioning from emergency shelters to independent living. The project would cost $2 million and require political support from multiple city agencies, exactly the kind of initiative that demonstrated how Elena's marriage to Dominic had transformed her ability to effect change. After Patricia left, Elena walked to her office window overlooking the street where she had grown up, invisible and forgotten. A year ago, she had passed by this building daily without imagining she would one day own it, renovate it, fill it with people working to solve problems she understood intimately. Her reflection in the window showed someone she was still learning to recognize. The scar remained visible, but it no longer dominated her appearance. Instead, it had become part of a face that radiated confidence and purpose. The face of a woman who had discovered that being wanted was not about perfection, but about authenticity and strength. The phone rang, interrupting her contemplation. Dominic's voice came through with the warmth that never failed to make her smile. How was the meeting with the councilwoman? Productive. She's supporting the shelter expansion, and she wants to introduce me to the mayor's task force on community development. Look at you, becoming a political power broker. Elena laughed. More like learning to use political power for something constructive. There's a difference. Any regrets about the path we've chosen? The question was one they asked each other periodically, acknowledging that their marriage had required both of them to evolve beyond their original expectations. Dominic had transitioned many of his business operations toward legitimacy, using Elena's foundation as a model for how organized crime families could direct their resources toward community benefit, rather than purely personal enrichment. No regrets, Elena said, meaning it completely. What about you? Falling to my knees in that diner was the smartest thing I ever did. Elena touched the pendant Dominic had given her on their wedding day, feeling the small key rest against her heart, like a promise kept. They had unlocked something together that neither had imagined possible, a love that transformed not just their individual lives, but their capacity to influence the world around them. That evening, Elena and Dominic walked through the community garden they had funded in the lot where Rosetti's diner once stood. Children played among vegetables planted by their families. Elderly residents shared benches in the peaceful space. Teenagers who might otherwise find trouble discovered purpose in tending growing things. Remember what you told me in the diner? Elena asked, watching a young girl help her grandmother water tomato plants. Which part? That you'd never met someone you couldn't bear to lose. Dominic stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression carrying the same intensity that had captured her attention months earlier in a destroyed restaurant. Still true. More true now than ever. Elena looked around the garden they had created together, seeing in it a reflection of their own growth from damaged individuals to partners capable of nurturing something beautiful and lasting. The invisible girl had become visible, valuable, and deeply loved. But more importantly, she had learned to see herself the way Dominic had seen her from the beginning, as someone worth falling to his knees for, someone worth building a better world with, someone worth loving completely and forever.